with that, let me begin the closing session with my first question directed to the Honorable Foreign Secretary of India, Ambassador Misri. Madam Ambassador Misri, as you leave this conference, let me stick to President Stubb's the power of three, and ask you to share with us three things you take away, three ideas, three things you heard, or three things that surprised you.
Thank you, Samir. Before I get to the Stubb triumvirate and the three impressions that I have from this conference, I just want to say that one thing that I learned right at the outset of the conference was that not only are you a terrific host and moderator of panels at these kinds of events, but you are also, you possess the hidden talents of a travel agent. So congratulations on bringing so many people together despite the severe flight disruptions that threaten to derail us. So my first takeaway actually is really related to that, which is that Raisina 2026 dealt so admirably with disruption. And despite everything that happened, you carried on. The numbers, as we can see from this full hall, remained impressive. The nature of the discussions, the content of the debate in the room remained of a consistently high quality. So full marks for, we speak so much about resilience these days, full marks for resilience at Raisina 2026. Please do give a hand of applause. The second thing that I took away is again something that I've been observing during the past decade plus of looking at Raisina, and I think it came up spades in this session as well, which was the unique convening power of Raisina. And I think we were talking a little bit about this in the anteroom just before we came on stage. The fact that this conference manages to gather points of view that are diametrically opposed to each other and does it so effortlessly. In 2023, I remember I was here at that time and happened to be in the audience to see Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and US Secretary of State Tony Blinken speak within a few hours of each other. And this year, we saw, and that was at the height of the Ukraine conflict. This year, we are again dealing with conflict, and you again managed to get the Israeli Foreign Minister and the Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister on either side of midnight. Mm-hmm. And I think that's again something that speaks to the inclusivity of Raisina, and that's a defining feature of this conference. Third and final one, I think is, obviously I have had the good fortune of being in a few rooms during the course of this conference and seen the ideas that have come up, the subjects that have been debated, the fragmentation of global order that seems to be upon us, this idea that has been introduced of a possible coalition of middle powers coming together and asserting themselves, the whole notion about value-based realism, and I think that's also in a sense the sub-theme for this session on, how do you do you look for convergence first, or do you look for causes to achieve? The role of the global south, I heard President Stubb mention the New Delhi moment, and I think there is a lot of takeaways from that as to what we can do. I mean, all of this was done with remarkable candor. It seems somehow that, when we are in conflictual environments, candor seems to spring forth. I'm not making a case for conflict because of candor there, but I think it's important that we have the opportunity to talk about all these trends in the international order, and these were really debated at length in different rooms during this conference. Of course, we had some interesting views from some of the conversations that were conducted on the sidelines with the US, with others, and I'm sure my co-panelists will have views about that, but those are my three big takeaways from this year's Raisina. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Misri. I'm going to come back to you on the fragmentation and maybe cooperation element. How do we cooperate in a fragmented world? And I'm going to ask you a question on that. But let me first turn to Prime Minister Harper. Prime Minister, your takeaways from Raisina Dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, great question. I have to be frank, Samir, that in spite of being chair of your advisory board, I haven't been at all of these things. I've given up trying to keep pace with you a long time ago. I was at, in fairness, a series of selected meetings, so, that kind of skews my take. But obviously, I paid a lot of attention to the geopolitical discussion. And I think there are kind of three pretty obvious takeaways. The Foreign Secretary's already made some reference to them. I think the first here that I detected from people outside the United States and China, I mean, admittedly, we don't have a huge Chinese presence here, is just increasing concern about the kind of the geopolitics that those two major powers are engaged in. Mm-hmm. And an understanding, I think an increasing understanding that these are very deliberate strategies. They're not apologetic about it. They're not seeking anybody's consent. This is where they're going. So I think that's a big concern. And then I think the second big takeaway on geopolitics is, at least among this group, which is obviously very policy oriented, is a sense that whether we like this geopolitics or not, it's not really addressing most of the problems that face humanity. Mm-hmm. And that, how do we get the focus back on that? And then I think the third big takeaway, once again, already referenced to it, is, to be blunt, along the lines of Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech in Davos, can middle powers form coalitions and alliances to effectively address issues in this context? Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of the big picture of how people are trying to grapple with the world right now.
So having to deal with unapologetic big powers, and finding ways of building new coalitions without those two necessarily being supportive or catalyzing any significant positive engagement. I think probably that's my take as well. So if anyone wants to ask me what do I take away, I think I concur with Prime Minister Harper on those two big points. Let me turn to you, Comfort. Your takeaways.
We're not going to allow you to get away with not. Leslie and I have questions for you as well, Samir. But I want to follow on what you said, Prime Minister.
Comfort, can you bring the mic close to your mouth?
Yeah, I want to follow up on what you both said. I think I would like us to think about practically what the New Delhi moment looks like. If we agree that there's sort of a new coalition, middle powers forming, what does that New Delhi moment look like? And how does it help us advance, which is one of the themes of Raisina Dialogue? And what does the architecture of the new future of cooperation really look like? We've heard some of it from your Prime Minister and Prime Minister Carney. We heard some of it also in the context of the AI Summit. And we heard some of that articulation from President Stubb here. So that's one takeaway. Can we come here next year, Samir, to start building the blocks out of what a New Delhi moment looks like? I think a challenge has been put down. You should grab hold of it and begin to define what that looks like as well. I think number two is that a year ago, Geopolitics Prime Minister, a year ago, we were told that the old liberal, neoliberal, interventionist trying to reorder a state was the past. And yet look at what we're seeing today, trying to rewire and order a new country. So what do we think about that? We're watching it live and direct. I'm talking about Iran here. I'm talking about the transformation of a region that is pivotal to all of us. So India, you've seen the effects of what's happening in the Middle East. We're seeing the effects also for what's happening in Europe. And when we're in the back room, Prime Minister, you talked about the energy effect as well. So how do we manage when you see these seismic conflicts happen? How do we come together to think about that in terms of the resilience as well? So that's my number 2 takeaway. And then the number 3 takeaway, which is a testimony to you, Samir. And I know you don't like to wear the testimony hats, but the future is always in the room when we come to Raisina, in the form of young people as well. So how are we making sure that we are capturing what the future is telling us so that it can begin to inscribe the present? So when you talk about assertion, accommodation, and advancement, how are those things shaping the very things that we're talking about? Is what I've always taken away from the 2 Raisina meetings that I've come to anyway. So thank you, and a credit to you for what you've done as well.
Thank you, Comfort. And I think I'm going to place those 2 big questions, the first two, to Ambassador Misri and to Prime Minister Harper in the next round. And I think those are interesting conversations to have, that what can be done. I don't think being helpless is an option. You may have unapologetic powers, you may have certain situations that are beyond your control, but I'm sure there has to be an institutional and collaborative response. And I'm going to pose that to all of you. Leslie?
First of all, thank you for having me. This is tremendous. This has been an extraordinary conference, and quite frankly, I was checking, as I'm sure many of us were, every hour, every day, after the strikes by U.S. and Israel on Iran, to see whether you would cancel. I think most people would have canceled. And to your extraordinary credit, you not only didn't cancel, you sort of, everybody across this room and those who have had to leave already, everybody, because you have cultivated so much goodwill across so many years amongst young people, amongst old people, and across the world, everybody was willing to just kind of put their hand in and do what you asked. And nobody was quite sure who was going to be on their panel, because obviously a lot of people couldn't come. But so I think, to your credit, and it sort of mirrors this broader question that you framed significant parts of the conference around, which is, do we need to stick to the rules and get buy-in and consensus? And there's a huge value and there's a lot of legitimacy attached to that. Or do we need to be agile and flexible and transactional and move with the moment? And you have really demonstrated in this conference that you've got to do both. We wouldn't be here if we were just playing by the rules and thinking very slowly and without that phenomenal level of agility and personal relationship. And the personal relationship is something that, unfortunately, I think is hollowing out, certainly in the West, and that you so magnificently, and the country, frankly, so magnificently facilitated through this venue. I couldn't agree more with Comfort. I was saying that there's something here where you feel equally comfortable, not entirely, but equally comfortable sitting next to a head of state or a former head of state, and a very young, dynamic, ambitious person, whether they're from India or from somewhere else. I think for me that the conference has really kind of had these 2 layers. It's this one layer that's trying to have the same highly important, significant conversations. The first panel I turned up to in the audience was on NATO. And it was mostly Europeans talking, and I was, it was a little bit of a disconnect between that and the real world as we're currently experiencing it across the Middle East and with all of its global impacts. And that tension between wanting to have the long-standing debates and dealing with a reality, which is that we have been completely and utterly disrupted in a way that I think is very, very disconcerting for all of us on a personal and on a political and on a strategic level. As I was walking in, I saw a tweet that the U.S. National Intelligence Council put out a report before the strikes that combined the intelligence of 18 intelligence agencies in the United States that said no level of bombardment would be able to remove this the regime in Iran. So the intelligence, the information, the events are phenomenally disruptive. I also would underline the challenge that was put to you, India, as needing to conceive of a Delhi moment. That referring back to the San Francisco moment. To be very honest, I think it was it's aspirational in a way that is currently not attainable. It's a great aspiration. I did find that this conference, it's felt like you said, the former prime minister said that it was about middle powers. I felt a real strand of Europe and India in this particular rendition of the conference, and I have felt like the U.S. is yes, there have been a few Americans here, but it's felt like the U.S. is completely
like 150 Americans here.
150 of how many people in this?
I mean, look, they're the largest group.
More than 3,000 people at the Ryzenia Dialogue. 150 people from the country that spends more than $800 billion a year on its national defense. I mean, there are very few Americans here, and you choose your measure. But in my mind, the absence of the U.S. in a variety of ways has actually been reflected throughout the dialogue. That is no criticism of anybody, but perhaps the Americans, and quite frankly, the disruption of this current week.
Mm-hmm. Philippe, your first time, and also perhaps your first day at the conference.
Yeah.
You represent the International Chambers of Commerce, the folks who make money, who create value. What you hear, does it square up with your worldview? How is your world looking at all of this?
What I indeed take away for this discussion so far is that, for the business, we have entered now into a very transactional, you mentioned, mode. And the question is, how can we live on the business on a transactional world compared to the alliances of the past, right? And if I speak as the chair of the International Chamber of Commerce, we represent 45 million businesses in the world through the chambers in 170 countries. And with our soft law, which is one standard in the Incoterms for all the trade in the world, we rule $17 trillion. And when things go wrong, we have the Court of Arbitration, and we settle $200 billion per year of claims. Okay? So then the question is, indeed, for the business, what is absolutely necessary in a world which is fragmenting? Just to give you an idea, last year, we have more than 3,000 breaches of the rule of law, or the WTO, in the world.
3,000 violations of the rule of law at the WTO.
Last year, and there were only 600 5 years ago. So it's like this. And now, with the US and the tariffs, we have entered into the weaponization of the tariffs, and other world as well. So this is the context. And in this context, make it simple for everybody in the room, business needs predictability, stability, and legal certainty to invest in the long term and to hire and so on. So this is the situation. And for the business, especially for all the SMEs, having a patchwork of all rules everywhere and very complex, it's unworkable. So we need some stability. It's clear that the WTO today is in a bad shape. Now, by the way, we made a study. If WTO were to disappear, developing and emerging countries will lose 5% of the GDP, okay? And they will lose up to 30 to 50% of their trade flows as well. So WTO has to stay, yes, but second, it has to be reformed, and we are looking for the MC14 in a few weeks in Cameroon to make some real moves for the reform. But what we see today is more and more plurilateral, bilateral agreements, and for instance, between India and the EU recently. So there are still a number of rules. And if you look on the ground, 72% of the flows of trade today are consistent with the clause of the most favored nation. So for the rule. And if you look at the imports in the US, which are creating in a big mess, it's only 13% of the imports in the world. So 87% of the rest wants rules. So there will be rules, either probably less one size fits all. The multilateral consensus will be very difficult. But there are basic principles that have to stay, like the most favored nations, like no discrimination, like the special and differential treatment. Few principles have to remain. But then, much more building on plurilateral approaches, and probably we'll enter a world where we will say probably will be on a variable geometry. And perhaps the second comment is about, the question is, how can the business compete today strongly on technology or whatever, and at the same time build long-term partnerships, Can you partner with your competitors?
Correct.
But the answer today is yes. And I take this example to conclude, which is the critical materials. And the Canadians are very familiar to the matter, right? The supply chains today are very complex. We know the world of oil and gas, where Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the US were governing the world in the last 40 years. It will stay still a while, but more and more with the new energy, renewables, critical materials are absolutely essential for mobility, for wind farms, power plants, and so on. And you cannot have full control of the mine when you are a car maker. So you must build these partnerships. And so situation is complex, and I think these bilateral and plurilateral approaches need to give some frames so that resource-rich countries can some benefits from the downside value. But this is only through a specific partnership. So here, I mean, we are in a situation with all these partnerships are absolutely necessary, but they will be politically more fragile. So we need some principles across the board.
So plurilateralism and bilateralism still require principles, otherwise these are fragile partnerships. I think that's the point in the absence of multilateral. Let me turn to Ambassador Misri again. So let me ask you, as a diplomat, how do you compete, cooperate and contest with the same person at the same time? Now, and this is happening all the time now. There are countries whom you disagree with vociferously on certain issues, and yet you are on the same corner on certain matters, and you know, you have to find a way of doing that.
Yeah, I think the answer really lies in getting past what I feel is this mental block created by this phrase called shared values. And there is this assumption that you can only cooperate with people over a long and sustained period of time if you share values there. I think the thing to look for really is less shared values and more shared value. It's only if there's value to be gained from a particular relationship that a partnership is going to work. So I think we need to get beyond shared values. Shared values are important, but they're not sufficient for partnerships where you're trying to solve a problem. And so, as you pointed out in your earlier remarks as well, we're seeing increasingly a trend where actors are coming together where they may be competitors in one domain, but they see value to be gained from partnership in another domain. I may have political differences with a country, but if I see value in advancing my agenda with regard to, say, climate mitigation, if I see value in advancing my agenda with regard to technology or with regard to even say counterterrorism or maritime security, then I will go look for those rooms where those problems are being solved. So I'm not in a particular room because I trust the people in that room. I'm in a particular room because the problem I'm looking for answers to is being solved or addressed in that particular room. So I think that's the framework within which you see this phenomenon of people gathering together where they would have been throwing brickbats at each other before, but now they've been thrown together because there is a partnership agenda there. I mean, after all, go back to the founding of the European coal and steel community. I mean, the ECSC was formed not because love and affection had broken out suddenly between France and Germany. It was built not on that affection, it was built on steel. And there was an agenda with regard to that. And therefore, today, I think what people are looking for is coalitions and partnerships. I know, yes, sometimes they are called coalitions of convenience or accidental coalitions. They're not really that accidental. I think people are looking for solutions, and they are less bothered by the issue of, do I share values there? More bothered by, is my problem going to be solved there? And this is especially important for a democratic country because you, at the end of the day, have to answer to people, and people demand solutions for their problems.
Ambassador, can I ask you one more question? We've heard through this conference the challenges of small countries. We've heard that since the opening address, coming from a smaller country, smaller nations, pooled sovereignty. We've heard the laments and the celebrations of being small. How's it being the foreign secretary of a big country? What are the kind of challenges that poses? I'm sure that's not everyone believes that just because you have size, that's an easy space to be in. But are there new set of factors that actually challenge diplomacy in some ways?
Look, I mean, to be frank, we are a big country. We are a big country in several respects. Big in population, a big area, increasingly large economy, already the world's fourth largest economy, on our way to be the third largest economy. But that doesn't mean that we don't have the same problems or the same complaints that you would imagine smaller countries having, smaller in different ways. And one of the problems that I would say that I confront as well in this role, and this actually takes away from a couple of things that were said by a couple of the co-panelists, which is this whole thing about rules. There is today a chafing across many smaller countries, and I think by definition, a lot of them are countries from the global south. The chafing is because of the rules according to which the so-called liberal international order has been run. We don't have a problem with the rules, but it's a question. The question is, did we have a voice in shaping the rules? So, when in terms of the processes in the world, we can't demand equal outcomes, but we can demand an equal voice in shaping the rules. So today, even as a representative of a large country, this is one of my agenda points. Who frames the rules of the coming world order? And we feel that if, some of the rules that according to which the world is being run today were framed 80 years ago. If rules don't evolve with time and adjust to reality, they lose their legitimacy. And they must adjust to the reality of, now we are at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. I think it's high time that rules changed. That's one of the things we grapple with on a daily basis.
So let me turn to comfort. Comfort, quick response to two aspects that were touched upon by Ambassador Misri. One, the hunt for the value-based world, and is that hunt itself creating disruptions? And if we were to focus on interests and shared outcomes, is that perhaps a better way? And the second question is the rules. And are rules the tyrants, or are they the enablers in some sense? Are rules the problem?
The tyrants or
the tyrants. The tyranny of rules, or is it the liberation through rules?
Yeah, I think there's an underlying theme here, which is about the sovereign choice of countries. I think that's one of the things that has become more ascendant in the last few years, that as you watch the rule makers become the rule breakers, I think that has given other countries a chance to review their own positions vis-a-vis certain issues and assert their own viewpoints. And that's one of the takeaways I've been watching, whether it's India or Brazil or Mexico or Turkey, that the ability of so-called middle powers or rising powers, whatever label you want to confer on these countries, the one consistent thread from all these countries is the ability to put on the table that you have a choice as a sovereign nation. And that, for me, is fundamental, and safeguarding that, regardless of what the future looks like, I think it's going to be imperative. Because if you can't safeguard your choice as a sovereign nation, it becomes hard to start thinking about what the value looks like or what the rules look like that will also accompany you. So that's sort of one big message that I would like to sort of put down. And we've seen it articulated by India in different ways, whether it's around climate issues, whether it's around the AI issue, whether it's around energy, also that the ability to say what your agency looks like in these issues on the table as you negotiate is what's going to matter regardless of what the world looks like going forward. And that's the only way I think you are able to minimize the disorder as well. So that's me. I mean, I think I've managed to answer both those questions together. The idea, of what also, I mean, I was interested in what you were saying, Minister, about how, your distinction between values and value. And I've never heard that articulation before. You have an interest. And in the end, it's your interest that defines what the rules are as well. And it's your interest also that makes it easier to have a transparent relationship as well. So it's not bound by anything else, and your morality also plays out in that story as well. So the rules are there, but in the end, what I look for, is the interest that drives you and is the value that binds those partnerships together. So, I'll stop there.
Prime Minister Harper, let me turn to you. Something Philippe mentioned was being able to partner with an assortment of actors today. I think Prime Minister Carney has gone about starting to do that in some sense. He's looking at various actors in the world who are important to Canada, building relationships across the Pacific, reaching out to India, reaching out to a few others. The European relationship seems to be revitalized. My question to you would be that as a transatlantic leader of your time, someone who was actually in many ways one of the faces of the European and America's relationship, what would you be doing today? What would be your mantra for the leadership of today?
Well, I've spoken about this publicly in Canada, and I wouldn't say that Prime Minister Carney and I are on exactly the same wavelength. That broadly speaking, I'd be doing the same thing. Canada's in a very unique position in that we are simultaneously a big country and a little country. We're a big country in that we are the 10th largest economy in the world. So we're bigger than the vast majority of 95% of other countries. But because our only neighbor is a country 10 times our size, we're in many ways a little country. And under the current circumstances, which, to be blunt, is not just dispute with the United States, but an active threat to the sovereignty of the country, Canada has no alternative but to diversify its contacts. Now, let me follow up there on what I think the broader lesson is, and I think the Foreign Secretary alluded to it. I put it in a little different terms. So we've been through this period of, what we call values-based, rules-based world order, and I would put it a little differently. We're moving away from values-based to what is frankly, kind of more traditional of human history, a more kind of realpolitik, interest-based. I always thought, when I was Prime Minister, I always thought of our foreign policy as kind of guided by three pillars: security, economics and prosperity, and democracy and values. And we've thought in Canada and many Western countries as democracy and values as being a really high priority. I think the reality is it's not going to be as high a priority going forward. And this is what I think Prime Minister Carney and, frankly, just about any Canadian government would do right now is focus on other linkages around security and economics as the priority. We can't afford, Canada cannot afford in the current circumstances to have conflicts with other countries based simply on values questions that are not directly related to our security and economic interests. And I think that more and more countries around the world, including in the West, will start to take that orientation.
Leslie, my question to you would be a question based on your current role as the head of a very dynamic think tank in Chicago. What are the debates happening at home in America? Is the worldview that the current establishment espouses a settled position, or are we going to see louder debates now beginning to, in some sense, enable some form of a larger either reversal or revertal, or perhaps even a normalization of what has been proposed?
It's a great question, and thank you for referring to the Chicago Council as being dynamic. It really isn't. It is, and I inherited some of that, and I intend to kind of take it to the max. I have a phenomenal set of people working with me in a variety of ways. It's an extraordinary place, and I hope all of you will come visit, but maybe not all at the same time. Look. Anybody who's paying any attention to the United States knows there's nothing special about me saying that the United States is deeply polarized, it's deeply divided, there's absolutely no consensus. There is one thing that stands out during the course of this conference. I think it was David Sanger who wrote the piece, noting that Trump is the only president in recent times that hasn't gotten a bump in his approval rating by going to war. There is nothing coming back at him from the American people in support of the strikes against Iran and the sort of, the day after and the days after. But the divisions are palpable. In Chicago, obviously, in the middle of the country, people are deeply worried about the international trade order, and that's from the C-suite. Many of the C-suite, the CEOs are, running major multinational companies that have a foothold in rural America, in agriculture, certainly in trade, and you don't hear Republicans or Democrats, rallying around the flag of tariffs and trade disruption. They certainly, to your point, they certainly want predictability and stability, and that's at the wealthiest Americans, many of whom are based in Chicago, and everyday people across not only the state of Illinois but across the middle of the country. So I think there's a lot of pushback. It's not articulated. We know that there's a lot of suppression. A lot of people don't feel comfortable speaking in the way that they might have spoken under a previous administration. The second thing that people have been very focused on is immigration. And while there has, as we all know, been a real support for having stronger immigration controls at the borders, there is no support. And the Chicago Council has been polling the American people for 50 years. We're not new to this work. Consistently for 50 years, there is no support for ICE going into people's homes, pulling them out of their beds, pulling children off the streets, ripping families apart, pushing people down to the ground. There's no support for it. So immigration is a huge point of conversation. The country is pulled inward to a large extent in the middle because of the extreme disruption to everyday life in ways that there's a weird duality. There's disruption. There are a number of things, sort of freedoms that people thought they had that are being encroached on. At the same time that, things look pretty normal, especially if you're in the middle or upper middle class or if you're wealthy, because the stock market's done phenomenally well. It's a dynamic, thriving economy. We've seen just in the last day that the job losses, the job numbers are coming down, so that might begin to change. But there's a big internal conversation. This war, I think, is going to change some of that. People have been thinking about Iran since 1979, not in a positive light, but to maybe pull it into what you said, about countries around the world want to know that they can't control the outcome, but they want a voice. Americans, too, want a voice, and they certainly don't think they've had a voice in the decision to launch a war in the Middle East. And we all know they've been tired of that, and they've wanted to move against that. So I think the desire for voice is very, very strong and not being heard. And final point, I will say is that it's on the sovereignty question. I think we need to be a little bit cautious about the sovereignty question. It sounds in principle like a great idea. It's been the bedrock of our world for more than 80 years, but we did spend a good amount of time talking about sovereignty with responsibility, recognizing that sovereignty isn't always a liberal thing. It's sometimes a weapon for very nasty leadership that are responsible for all manner of oppression. We're moving away from that. It's gotten very complicated, but we shouldn't, hold sovereignty up at this, as this sort of unconditional good. Just because we're moving to a world that's more transactional and where we want to be more agile. And we also need to unpack what we mean by values. People keep saying values versus, I don't know what values people are talking about. Many far-right organizations from across Europe are currently apparently traveling to the United States to participate in a sovereignty conference. I don't quite know what it's about. That's one set of values. I don't think that's what everybody means when they sit on your stage. But, there are a lot of values out there. And if we're going to talk about values versus interests, say what they are.
You got a comfort moving there.
I think when countries are being tariffed or slapped down or being forced to take a particular position, I think when a number of countries are finding that it's pretty existential for them, that there's direct interference in their politics. So right now we're watching a number of countries. I mean, you said it pretty well, Prime Minister. It's pretty existential for Canada. We're watching a number of countries where their politics is being interfered with. It's important that those countries know how they can use their sovereignty to safeguard themselves from that direct threat coming from the outside. As we are speaking, we are watching direct interference into Panama, into Ecuador, into Venezuela, into Colombia. We look in the Middle East. You look across European countries. You are seeing direct interference on the stages of major security platforms into a country like the United Kingdom, into a country like Spain, which has chosen its position, and you're threatening them with tariffs and different kind of assets because you can't bend them to your way. So because you can't bend those countries to your way, you throw all sorts of machinery. So maybe I should unpack what I mean about sovereignty. That's what I mean. And the fact that you can stand up to that, India, for example, and withstand that, and try and find your own ways to do the somersaults, is precisely what a Mark Carney is trying to do. It's precisely what an India is trying to do. And it's precisely what you're seeing some European countries try to do. So it's a positive focus on sovereignty and not the more negative and pernicious one that I think you and I grew up with.
Philippe, let me turn to you very quickly for your response to this particular segment. And then I'm going to ask you all to end the panel with one good idea for 2026 for global leaders. Okay, so we have to give some advice to those who watch this conference. I'm going to ask you all to give one advice to global leadership for 2026. But Philippe, any quick response to this debate?
Yes, about this question of transactional and find a way. The rule of law is absolutely, excuse me, the rule of law is absolutely necessary. And we cannot be for the business in the world where the golden rule is the one who has gold makes the rule, right? No, we cannot. So the question is indeed how we can move on this situation.
No, but tell me, let me ask you a question. The Supreme Court of America has given a ruling on the tariffs. What is the ICC view on that?
Well,
I mean, since you are a follower of rule of law, now the law has spoken. So tell me, what has the position the ICC has taken on the rule of law? I think power politics still is prevalent. It's not rule of law. Now go ahead.
But I tell you what ICC does here, because we have a responsibility. I think the more we put the business in the loop, the better it is, okay? And what we've done is what we call a compact for trade, jobs, and growth. What it is we are making a proposal to the WTO about the reform of WTO as it is, to make it more simple and so on. But also, we are looking very concretely on the topics which are creating a problem today. Subsidies. So we say they are not good or bad subsidies. Well, they are, at least there should be a process to look at how the industrial policies are translating in subsidies, yes or no. And so we are proposing some processes. We do the same on trade flows and data, which is a question, and we are pushing for the next ministerial so that we can continue the moratorium on data flows. So it would be a disaster otherwise. So we are making very concrete, the same on export controls, weaponization of critical materials. In some cases, export controls are necessary, but there should be a proper frame and so on. So we took the things very concretely. And, my plea is that, take ICC, for instance, we are an observer at the United Nations level. We are an observer at the World Customs Organization. But we are not an observer today on the World Trade Organization. So the result is that all the emerging problems, which are more and more significant, they are not dealt with because WTO still lives, it was 30 years ago that rules were given. There was no problem with climate, digital was not an issue, and all this. And we are not putting the rules, and we are not elaborating the rules at the proper, rhythm, to cope with the changes of the world.
Okay, so now we move to the fun part. One advice for global leaders out of Raisina. So I think, Leslie, you have your advice ready, right? Yeah. So I'm going to start with you.
Invest in making artificial intelligence something that plays to our advantages and is on the side of all of society. Get China policy sorted and try to do it with other partners. And 3, I think, is actually the biggest one. Invest in the institutions, formal and informal, of civil society. Because if those do not remain strong across our countries, then game over for any meaningful collective action that points in the direction in which we hope for it to point. I will say, you have to answer the question too, Samir. We did say we would ask him a question. So you have to answer the question, but maybe you don't have to go next.
Comfort.
I'm going to agree with Leslie. So we have to keep our eye on technology and the frontier. I would even, not just AI, but we should be concerned about the double-edged sword of social media for our young population. That's really worrying as well. I would inverse your question, and I would say if you're looking for leadership, follow Pope Leo, because he's really on the ball in terms of being very clear on some of the fundamental issues, whether it's migration, whether it's children, and whether it's the going into unnecessary wars as well.
Philip, you want to come in with some advice?
Oh, idea for now, 2026?
Yes.
Yeah, well, it's for me, for the business, it's simple. We have to enter, we have the MC14 in Yaoundé, in 2 or 3 weeks.
MC14, yes.
Yeah, the ministerial conference of WTO, that all the states around the table, they find a way to enter into new reform of the multilateral trade. And so that we find, not overnight, but with a real program, time-bound, deliverables on the key matters which creates all the barrier to trade. We have to enter into an area where trade is still a win-win. It's not a win-lose, okay? And so we have to find a way and to find a way.
MC14, the ministers should work on trade reforms. Yeah. Prime Minister Harper?
So maybe 2 sets of advice for political leaders. As I say, partly do what Canada is doing, try and lessen your dependencies and multiply your relationships. But frankly, when it comes to big powers, you're not going to get anywhere lecturing them about rules. You have to address their interests to some degree. That's just a reality. For business leaders, I've been saying the same thing for almost a decade, started 9 years ago here. Face the fact that, for years we believed that the difference in political systems and the different interests of countries was a negligible or constantly declining business risk. This is just not so. These risks are real, and what companies and businesses have to do in this international environment, if you're crossing borders, is you have to fully assess your risks, you have to seek ways of limiting them, and you have to build in redundancies and supply chains, investment chains, everything else. And as I say, you just got to accept that this new world is much more fractious and much more risky.
Ambassador Misri, you have literally the final word.
Well, a very short word, just to take off from what Prime Minister Harper said, about the interests of the big powers. And in that context, this might seem somewhat aspirational, but it was my wish last year, and it remains my wish this year as well, in terms of advice, is that the world needs to be a fairer place. And I think until that happens, you will see the kind of fracture that you see across the globe today. Reforming institutions, reforming rules, what we were talking about on this panel, is the first step there. I'm not making the Indian case here, but I think it's a scandal that Africa does not have a larger voice at the global table, since more than half the decision-making of the UN Security Council happens on Africa-related issues, and there is not an African voice at the table in a decision-making role or in a proper role. But my more specific advice, suggestion is that we need a reform of global developmental financing policies. I think multilateral developmental lending is still in a crisis. The large parts in the world need that. As a middle power, India is doing with its limited purse what it can. I think the bigger countries can do much more. There is need for a new way to look at developmental lending afresh.
I think that's something that we began Raisina dialogue with, that how do we recenter development into world affairs? And I think that's something that's been missing. We are not going to have any final words or concluding remarks. All I'm going to request is my colleagues behind the production desk to put the poster.
What's your big take? What's your advice for 2026? What's your advice to all of us?
Okay, I have three advices like all of you. Number one, recenter development into world affairs. That's number one. Number two, come back to Raisina next year. And number three, thank this wonderful team that has put it all together. They are on the screen. So this is the travel agency that was responsible for Raisina this year. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us over the last 2.5 days. And we hope to see you again later this evening for the curtain call and next year for more debates. Thank you very much for your time, energy, and participation. That's all from New Delhi.